But at some point, and that point is now, we've got to get past all the criticizing and all the deconstructing and come up with what is constructive. What do we need to do to help boys and men become the kind of ultimately men that we want and need from them?
Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What? So I would love to just start off with an introduction of yourself and your background, and particularly about your book, Better Boys, Better Men. Maybe what inspired it and why you think it's important.
Sure. My name is Andrew Reiner, and I am the author of Better Boys, Better Men, the new masculinity that encourages greater courage and greater emotional resiliency. And I may have gotten that subtopic wrong because it's been a long time since I looked at it. My work really over the past, I'd say, about 6 or 7 years has really been more and more focused in the space of writing about, speaking about, advocating for boys and men and for their well-being and their mental health. My book, Better Boys, Better Men, my first book, was very much a passion project, as most books are, but was very much a passion project that grew out of my own experiences. No surprise there. Growing up as a boy, as a young man, as a middle-aged man. I think a lot of younger men, especially today, can identify with my own trajectory of feeling often that I just didn't fit the mold. And I didn't fit the mold of the expectations. And in many ways, when I was growing up and when I was really cutting my teeth as a young man, there really weren't a lot of other avenues and other outlets that you could pursue to get validation that, hey, this is okay, that you show vulnerability, that that you're a sensitive guy. And so what I ended up doing, because I was always a bit of a fighter, a bit of a scrapper, I always pushed back. And even though it made me feel even more alone than I often did, to me it was a hill worth dying on. I was convinced, because I was such a fighter, that I was going to pursue who I was in a very authentic way. And basically people were either going to take it or, accept it, or they won't. And I became okay with that. It became, I think, more difficult in some ways in the romantic relationships I was in, because it sometimes could make my girlfriends uncomfortable, with my sensitivity, my vulnerability. And then fast forward, I become a father, and father to a son who's now 13, boy who's now 13. And that really was, there were a number of reckonings that I had throughout my life, periods of my life where I felt that it really kind of, pushed the aperture of my awareness about the kind of man that I wanted to grow into wider and wider open. So that by the time that I became a father, I was already on a kind of a journey of authenticity and self-awareness in terms of who I wanted to show up as in terms of being a man. When I became a father, it was probably the largest reckoning, because it forced me to look at and re-examine a lot of my own biases, a lot of my own baggage, and to really force the hand at a lot of questions. How was I going to help to raise this son? Because I knew fully well that when he got a little bit older, and the moment he walked out of the door, in some ways, he was going to have a target on his back in terms of the expectations of how he was supposed to show up as a boy. And so I knew that I didn't want to overwhelm him with all these expectations about vulnerability and sensitivity. And on the other hand, I also didn't want to, encourage an identity in him that didn't align with my own values. I mean, literally just from when he was born, I already was experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance about what this meant, being a father to a son, because I knew what was at stake. And so I already at that point was starting to do a little bit of writing about masculinity, and I was teaching a college course on that topic that I'd created. And when my son was born, everything just went into overdrive. And suddenly, if my antennae were up before, they were up around the clock now. And so really, that was really what I think pushed me to want to write more and more exclusively about masculinity and all the different challenges and all the different wrinkles to what it means to be a man of the 21st century, because it really forced my hand to really think a lot more about it, so that I could try to get on the track to be the kind of father that I wanted to be for my son. And so as often is the case with books, no matter what topic people write about, there often are a lot of self-serving reasons that authors will write the book, which when you think about it makes a lot of sense because they've got skin in the game, whatever that looks like. And so for me, it was very much about figuring out what was important in terms of me being a father and raising this boy, because I really wanted this to be a conversation, not just about with myself in this book and not just, with my son, but with other boys and other men as ways of trying to help them figure out as well what really mattered and how they could have access to the kind of wardrobe that wasn't all gray, black, navy blue, literally and figuratively, all the limited colors that we hand to boys and men.
Yeah, so many layers in there. The significance of this study going from academic to personal, kind of driving your energy to like elevate the significance of this work is really cool. And the tightrope balance of discussing or fathering the values that you find so important and are studying, and the knowledge that your son is going out into a world that doesn't have the same upbringing, and so kind of realizing that exposure is a potential risk, right? Showing those vulnerabilities, and so that's a balance, and an interesting point to bring up, as every guy in the world has to come up against at some point the broader mold and expectations that the rest of this society has. And so who you are when you run into those mold and expectations matters a lot. So really interesting to hear your perspective, like you yourself growing up and then fathering a son who's at the age where they start bumping into those molds and expectations. I'm curious if you've done any work or thinking on like what contributes to that mold and expectations and how it might be changing. Like what are some common influences in media pop culture that create that mold, and are there any like recent changes, positive or negative, that you could see those moving towards?
One of the things, to give you a concrete example of one of the things that I think is on the negative part of the spectrum. When my son was born and I would read books to him, so many of the books that I would read had these very, very kind of stereotypically binary representations of mothers and fathers. And so, the characters that were little children, be they animals or human children in the stories, were always getting from their mothers the kind of nurturing, the wisdom about emotional intelligence, and the kind of nurturing love that they needed, at different points in the story. The fathers were often the characters who they would go on adventures with, who, they would do extremely cool things with. And sometimes in some books, the father was the cool guy and was fun and was, playful. And sometimes he would be the stern disciplinarian. Depends on the era in which the book was written. What I would do, because I wanted my son, even when he was pre-verbal, to start to get the understanding that fathers can show up for their children the same way that mothers can. What I would start to do, because I had nothing else at my disposal, is I would often change the mother character to a father, so that, not because I have anything against mothers or women, never have, never will, but because it was so important that my son could get that balance and see that fathers do this as well. And so, it would be, where a story, sometimes would be just a mother, with her children, and I would just change it to the father. So my son could see that. That's one of the definite negative things. The good news is that since then, I'd say really since over about the past 10 years, or maybe even a little bit less, there's been there's been a lot more books coming out for children that speak to some of the issues that all children struggle with around, different kinds of fears, different kinds of sensitivity, different kinds of vulnerabilities. And there's been a lot more about that I think speaks to boys as well. And that's been wonderful. Now, that said, I feel, though, Henry, that a lot of the messages that we're getting in pop culture And I'm actually writing about this right now for my second book. I'm actually working on this chapter right now. A lot of the messages that we're getting, and this is a really this is a spiraled conversation that could easily take a long time. I feel like a lot of the representations we're getting of males in pop culture right now are not doing a good job of helping boys and young men have the kind of representations that they need to see in themselves. And so, when you look at Hulu and especially Netflix, and this has been the case for about 5 or 6 years, when you look at a lot of the movies and the streaming shows, especially ones that are geared towards younger audiences, teens and young adults, the representations often are it's difficult to find a main character protagonist who is male. And again, I have nothing at all against females being the protagonist or the main character at all. But the problem is that we've gotten really kind of out of balance with this. And so many of the characters are female protagonists, and they represent wonderful characteristics and traits, resiliency, mental toughness and strength, having compassion and wisdom. And a lot of the characters you'll see that are male, when they do show up, are often really portrayed in ways that can actually be a bit demeaning to males. They can be these kinds of, tertiary characters who are goofy, who are these kind of like fun-loving sidekicks who really are kind of clueless. And I mean, I could, go in and give you lots of concrete examples, or they're villains. There's a show that there's a wonderful show called Circle Round, which is on WBUR, and it's a radio show, and you can get it on like Spotify. And it's a fantastic show with wonderful messages, and it's really geared towards younger children. And they take folk tales from around the world, and they have professional actors reading the parts, and it's wonderful. And there's wonderful messages and themes for the kids. One of the things that's very problematic, and this is an example of what I'm talking about, is that 90% of the time in their like 300 episodes, the protagonist that is a very likable, sympathetic character is female. And then the males often are the ones who are greedy, who are the villains, who lack compassion, who lack empathy. And this sends a really powerful message to both boys and girls, which is that, females are the ones who are wise, who have compassion, who can see the bigger picture and know what really matters in life, and know how to treat people well. And this just happens time and time again. And it got to the point where I couldn't even play it for my son anymore because it just got to be so frustrating. You could look on Spotify, you can look on TikTok. There are playlists of things about, songs that for hating boys. There's a lot of pushback going on right now, that I think a lot of boys and young men are experiencing. And I think it's part of the reason that there's been such a big groundswell of boys being attracted to really deleterious places like the manosphere. Don't think it's a coincidence that they're being drawn to these places. It's not because they are all toxic masculine. It's not because of that. It's because a lot of them feel that so many spaces in our culture feel unwelcome to them and feel critical of them just for showing up as male. We're really at an inflection point right now. It's challenging because on the one hand, I think that there's a much greater context there that we're not looking at as a culture as to why they're going there. And again, it's not because they're all bad seeds at all, and they're not all toxic men. I think a lot of it is because they want places where they can feel validated just for being who they are. And when a lot of boys and young men go to these spaces on the manosphere, initially, that's what they're drawn to. And then, of course, there are the problems with being on the manosphere, things that can lure them in that are really dangerous for young, unsophisticated minds.
Yeah, I think you nailed it for like what draws guys into those communities, because it's rare to find online celebrating and welcoming, hey, you're a man and you demonstrate these traits, like we love that, and don't let anyone tell you that it's wrong. And if when those are the only spaces that you find that you feel are accepting, it's very natural that you're drawn in. I agree. I think the correction on in media towards kind of demoting men to lesser positions is both like understandable in the emphasis for representation of or de-emphasizing like the classical like male superhero role that maybe played out, but is losing what we really need in those protagonist roles is like the nuanced, emotionally intelligent, complicated male figure in those roles. We're losing that, and so and that is a loss just in and of itself, and it paves the way for men going down channels looking for those spaces for acceptance because they're not seeing it celebrated on screens and radio. So I think you captured that path really clearly.
I'm glad that's something that you've picked up on as well. Just because it feels sometimes, when I have conversations about this, people say, look, what are you working on with your new book? And I talk about this very topic. And I know sometimes people, feel that, oh, well, don't you think you're looking a little bit too much into this? And I'll say, no, to be honest, it's so consistent that I see it time and time and time again. And I'm wondering why aren't other people bringing this up? The problem for a lot of young men, especially, and older boys, is that when I go to schools and I'll talk with them about these things, they see it all the time. They're crystal clear about seeing these kinds of representations. The reason that they don't bring it up, though, is because nobody gives them the microphone to do this. Nobody wants to hear it in schools because schools are not spaces that feel safe, quite literally, to a lot of boys and young men. And they know that they will be ridiculed for what they say and how they say it. And I hear this time and time again when I work at boys' schools. This is true for a lot of the young men that I teach at the college level as well. They do want to talk about these things. They do want to air their frustrations and their concerns, but we're not in a space right now in this culture where we want to open up that conversation. And so, as you were just saying, sadly, it's not a coincidence that a lot of them are going to these spaces that are the only ones that really feel validating to them. And that's a huge conversation that we need to really have more of. We really do.
Agreed. I'm wondering if there's advice in maybe the reactions that folks have had to your work in either reacting negatively, as in it's moving away from traditional principles they agree with, that like historically rooted in like who a man should be, how you talk through that, like we're losing these traditional values as they bring in more nuance to how men should be growing up. How do you react to those kind of conversations?
One of the things that this work, being in these spaces of masculinity and talking a lot with boys, young men. For my first book, I did a lot of interviews with middle-aged men and even some older men. One of the things it's taught me is that that to throw out all of the aspects of traditional masculinity, is basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And that's what a lot of people in a lot of the narratives, in a lot of legacy media, basically are really kind of suggesting and going along with those messages, which is that if there's any aspect of traditional masculinity that you're really kind of adhering to, then there's something problematic about that. And I think for a while, I actually, before I wrote the book, wasn't leaning exclusively in that direction, but I was willing to entertain that a lot more. And so when I got into the weeds in these conversations with a lot of young men and middle-aged men when I was doing my first book, it really opened my eyes in a really beneficial way. And it made me realize that there are aspects to traditional masculinity that absolutely are positive and generative, and that there are too many places in the media today, especially, and in a lot of the conversations, where we're quick to say, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because when a lot of people say, let's crush, the patriarchy, that's a lot of what they're talking about. They're no longer just talking about, the need to share power, which I think we can all agree with that. My God, we can all agree with the need to share the power. But when a lot of them talk about the importance of crushing the patriarchy, for a lot of people who speak to that now, they're no longer talking about only sharing power. They're talking about that traditional masculinity equals toxic masculinity. I was just at a college in Kentucky back in November giving a talk. And these were the kind of things that during the talk that I was discussing. Afterwards, we did a Q&A, and we went off to a separate room to do the Q&A, and about 30 people followed in for the Q&A, which was great. And at the front of the room sat some young women and young men who identified as ardent feminists. They spent about the first 20 minutes to half hour of the Q&A really just kidnapping the conversation and really just going back and forth about all the ways that masculinity was detrimental and that there was really nothing redeeming about it. So this is a good example of the question you ask. After about 20 minutes or half an hour, I said, look, okay, excuse me, I want to interrupt. You guys have had the floor. We haven't had a Q&A. All you really did was ask me one question, and then all of you have been taking turns, basically just you're tag teaming each other and just looking for different wrinkles of ways to kind of really tear down all aspects of masculinity. And I said, that's an important thing to do, is to really look at closely and carefully, what about masculinity is no longer serving men and serving the rest of us? Absolutely. But at some point, and that point is now, we've got to get past all the criticizing and all the deconstructing and come up with what is constructive. What do we need to do to help boys and men become the kind of ultimately men that we want and need from them? We need to start talking about ways that we can help boys and men, because so much of the deconstructing you've been talking about shows how inadequate so many boys and men are at self-advocating for a lot of, for ways that they were taught that they didn't ask for. So what can we do moving forward that can be beneficial for everyone ultimately? That was my answer to them about throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the conversation about masculinity. One of them stood up and said, I don't need this shit. I'm done. They all stood up, cussed me out, I kid you not, and headed for the door. Once they left, the molecular tone in the room changed dramatically. And suddenly, a lot of other people who stayed behind started speaking up, young men and young women. And we started having the kind of conversation that was constructive. So this is the kind of thing that I encounter a lot. And I encounter it a lot when I go to colleges. I don't go to a lot of colleges, but when I do go to colleges, I encounter this kind of thing a lot. I will give talks about the ways that young men are struggling, how and why, and what we can do to help them. And when I have, and it's been to faculty, the first people always to speak up, almost always, are people in gender studies departments. They're always women, and they're indignant. And they always say, why are we shining a light on men, on boys and men? We've done that long enough. So this is the kind of thing I still encounter all the time. And I often will say, look, it really boils down to this. If we want to have the kind of boys and men that you keep saying that we want, we're never going to get there by endlessly complaining and criticizing and tearing down. At some point, the conversation has to pivot to what can we do to help construct, to help build the kind of masculinity that we say we want.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing, and so the pieces of what you shared represent like how charged that environment and conversation can be. And as soon as the word masculinity pops up on a sign or a lecture or an auditorium, it's like this is bad, and people are trying to celebrate these toxic traits, and it just shuts up the conversation, and it generates defensiveness in the young boys and men. It's like, oh, I really can't talk about any of these topics. I gotta shut down, and no one's gonna listen. And like you said, like there is definitionally a problem in young boys and men. You look at the numbers on loneliness and violence and suicide rates. Like if we don't talk about it, nothing happens, and the problem that is evident persists. And so I appreciate you forging through with the conversations against the friction, and it's always going to be there, right? It's just making the bridge to have the conversation past the initial shutdown. So I really appreciate you sharing that experience. The other concept I wanted to ask you about was breaking down masculinity into its component parts, into like positive and negative traits to see more nuance. Is that a structure that you find helpful? Is that outdated? Like in your coursework, how are you explaining the umbrella of masculinity? Because how you position it is so important for people's understandings. Like, is the word even useful? Like when you try and break it down, what structure are you displaying?
It's by design. One of the things when I've taught the course that I always will say to students at the very, very beginning of the semester is the goal in this course for me is not to come up with a definitive definition of masculinity. And one of the reasons for that, clearly it's very intentional, is because that's been one of the problems. To look at this on the flip side, when there are conversations, about feminism, for instance, in gender studies courses, the question rarely, if ever, comes up: what does it mean to be a woman? It's not a question that really is ever on the table, and that's fine, because one of the things we finally have done a fantastic job with, and this is what I kind of walk students through. One of the things we finally have done a fantastic job with, and I'm going to go back to that wardrobe metaphor, is we say to girls and young women, go ahead, look at the rack, take anything off the rack you want. It all is acceptable, and we will support you no matter what you wear. We're not there yet with boys. We're still not there yet with boys. That's why at the beginning of the beginning of the semester, I will say, I want to look at the different ways that we can open up that wardrobe to boys and men, because it needs to be as customized for boys as it is for girls. And so now that's kind of the approach, that I often take when I'm having those kinds of conversations. Now, that said, if we look at, what are some aspects of traditional masculinity that are beneficial and generative, and what are some that maybe, we should kind of look at, re-examine in terms of maybe it's not working so well. I do think that the notion of being of the expectation of being accountable, like for instance, being accountable, for instance, in the context of a family, whether it's as a father, whether it's as a husband, whether it's as a son, that there's an old notion of masculinity, not that you need to be a father figure, in lieu of the father, but that you do need to step up and to be accountable. That's one of the older kind of notions about, that you step up and you need to be accountable and you need to learn. Really, that's a form of leadership. That is something to a degree, I believe we really do need to help boys and young men learn, because so many boys and young men today are falling through the cracks. And this is something in my next book I'm getting into a lot. We see it at all levels of education, starting in about mid-elementary school and about third or fourth grade, all the way through high school. If young men go on to college or university, we see it there. We're even seeing it at the graduate school levels. We're seeing it in the workplace with employment. One of the things that to me was so surprising when I was really going into the weeds in the research for my book is that even with college degrees, young men are twice as likely compared to young women with college degrees to be unemployed. And that's not a coincidence. That's not a coincidence. And it's not a criticism of young women at all. But what's happening is that, and then of course, as you alluded to, there is, it's not a coincidence that young men are 3 to 4 times more likely than their female peers to take their own lives. That's not a coincidence. When we look at these kinds of things, and it's also interesting to look at sports, and I won't go into the weeds too much on this, but when you look at, and when you talk to coaches, one of the things that a lot of coaches don't have issues with their female athletes is work ethic. One of the things, if you talk to coaches at say the high school level, one of the things that a lot of them will talk about is how difficult it is to get their young male athletes to practice hard and to take practice seriously and to embrace the idea of process. And this is something I've heard when I was doing my first book, I heard from coaches. And that is something that's part of the reason that a lot of boys and young men are not doing well in school. They're showing up for the big moments, the big test, the big game, but they don't want to put in the work day in and day out, whether it's in the classroom or on the field or the court. And again, this is not a coincidence. This is kind of a mindset that's going on. And so that's why I think when we talk about a positive aspect of masculinity with leadership, I think that's something we need to hang on to, because I think that that is something that we do need to really inculcate in boys and men, not just talk about it. Because if you don't know how to do something, talking about it, over and over, you need to be a leader, is only going to make you feel shame. And there's nothing productive about shame to that extent. So I think we need to really start getting down to brass tacks and teaching boys and young men what really leadership really means. And so I think that that is an aspect. I think
That
that when we talk about things we need to let go of, you're not going to be surprised to hear me talk about the difficulties of being willing to ask for help, because we talk a lot about, thankfully now, and you're doing such a great job with this, talking about the need to learn to be okay with asking for help when we're having mental health issues. That is actually part of a much bigger problem for a lot of boys and men, because that is one of the big vestiges of traditional masculinity that still lingers, regardless of how progressive you are about your masculine identity. A lot of boys and men still feel that in order to really show up as an ascending man, they need to do things on their own. And of course, mental health issues are a huge part of that, but that's not the only thing. That is an aspect of masculinity that we need to re-examine. We definitely need to look at that and teach boys and men the strength, the courage and the wisdom of learning when it's time to ask for help.
yeah,
And one of the things that, in line with that, that we need to teach them, that's part of this, is how to recognize things, physical sensations in their bodies of anxiety, of depression, of stress, because they manifest, anxiety and depression, for instance, manifest a little bit the same, but also very differently from girls and women. And so a lot of boys and men don't even know what's going on in their bodies to recognize the symptoms when they're having these mental health issues. And so that's another part of understanding when to ask for help. But you also need to be taught to learn how to recognize the symptoms as well within your body.
yeah. I've spoke at great length about the trying to reposition the asking for help as a strength. And language is so important, and I've toyed with the words for how to emphasize the significance of that. And I for me, it really comes down to not employing like the human superpower of community and family. Like we humans are strong because of the groups that we have and what we can do together. And if you're not able to ask for help, you are foregoing that massive asset in your life that is your human network. And the people that can do it really are. And for me, that's been like a helpful framing for like this is something, an asset to aspire for, and it like a useful tool, and not like a clutching grab for help that feels weaker and harder to get your mind around. And that what you
Oh,
said about like
absolutely.
the physical sensations of anxiety and depression, I think also, yeah, getting guys in tune, in touch with their bodies and sensations is super important.
Absolutely. And in line with that, one of the things that I'll often discuss with older boys and young men is that one of the reasons, and this is such a simple thing, but it's so hard for us to understand, because it's that idea of, like you talked about, being in community and asking for help in the community. One of the things that we know girls and young women, almost all women, are so good at is what I call creating safety nets, emotional safety nets. And they have those safety nets in varying degrees when they struggle. And one of the reasons that's so important is because it really takes huge bites out of alienation and in turn loneliness, right? We were just talking about a few minutes ago. That is so important. And so the idea of being in community is something that is really alien to a lot of boys and young men because they're not raised to be in community in the parts of their being that matter the most, which is their mental health and their well-being around mental health. One of the things I talk a lot about with boys and young men is the importance of learning, and this has to be taught to them. It's not something they can easily do, how to create these forms of community, these safety nets, because they help when it comes to success in school. And research has shown this. I could easily go into that. But they also help, of course, when it comes to supporting each other when they're going through difficult times. And one of the most important things, which you talked about earlier, that these safety nets help with boys and young men is realizing they are not alone. And that alone is such a profound understanding for boys and young men to realize I'm not alone. That right there is a huge game changer for them to understand the power and the importance of being in these kinds of small communities.
Hmm. The other way I think about it is like diversity of anchor points. And so many, especially as guys get older, it whittles down into like these really, really narrow buckets of like job and partner. And sometimes things don't work out. You get fired from your job or you have a breakup, and then your one or two anchor points are just gone. And there's no community there for you to fall back on. And I see this manifest online with posts or reels about um I don't know, average male like community, and it's some like soldier tramping through the snow completely alone, and with 600,000 likes. It's like guys relate to like tramping through life, soldiering on alone without that community. And so I think that's kind of another tangentially important component of like this masculinity work, is because it makes community too. Like it's not just learning about the nuances of masculinity. It's bringing guys together and demonstrating that there are other people talking about this that they can relate to. So I think that
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah,
almost
I'm
like a
sorry.
byproduct of the conversation of itself, is just bringing the people together.
It is for a lot of males of all ages. It really is a matter of it's not something that we can do through osmosis because so few of us have been socialized this way. A lot of us have to literally be, we've got to be taught this, in very simple small ways that don't feel scary and that don't feel, intimidating. So for a lot of us, we really have to go through those hoops. I went through a period about 5 years ago. I was really trying to up the ante with a lot of my friends in terms of, emotional transparency and disclosure, to talk about the things, that were difficult, that were challenging, that I was struggling with, and for them to do the same thing. I couldn't find it. And it even got to the point where I'd made a new friendship, which, as you just talked about, gets harder as we get older. I made a new friendship with a guy who is a therapist for men. And even with him, it was so difficult to have that degree of disclosure. And I have an old friend who also is a therapist, and so often, when I want to share something with him, he's completely open to it, but there's no reciprocity. Even when I say to him, please know that this goes both ways, and please know that you can talk with me, and I will be quiet and just bear witness. I won't even say anything. I'm happy to do that because you do that for me. I want to do that for you. Crickets. This kind of thing is not easy for us to find. It's really not. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when a lot of young men do find it, it often has to be in the context of a men's group. They've got to go out and find like-minded men who are willing to create this container, take these risks. But and one of the things that when I've interviewed men about being in men's group and saying, do you take a lot of this out into the real world? Not all of them, but many of them will say, not to the extent that I can do it here, not even close. And some will say, I don't even try because I can't replicate this outside of the real world. That speaks volumes. That's what we're talking about just how difficult it is to create this. It's not complex. You and I both know that. It's not complex, but it's too hot to touch for so many young men and men. Even if they want it, it just they don't know how to go about doing it. And that's why I'm saying I think it's something that we really need to start teaching. In fact, when I go to boys' schools, I talk about the importance of teaching this in schools. I really think that we need to start creating these little circles in very non-threatening ways that just normalize talking about these kinds of things, because then it does sink in through osmosis, and then it's something that you can carry with you when you move, as you develop and move into other circles.
Totally. Yeah. I think just getting some reps early on of sharing low stakes problems. Hey, I twisted my ankle. I can't be in practice for 2.5 weeks, and like that's gonna be really hard for me mentally. Like things that are
Yeah.
normal, but just gets the door open of telling a friend, hey, I have this problem and I wanted to talk to you about it, and what's going on in your life. That check-in is so simple, but I think could save so many lives because it builds that reflex
That's
of
right.
I have problem, let me talk to a friend. And I know every guy out there who's ever lost a friend wishes they reached out, for sure, of course. And but that reflex isn't there. And if you can't do it with small problems, the bigger ones feel so much scarier that you're just dumping
Yeah.
this huge big problem on your friend, your buddy, and that you don't want to do. But all your friends want that. All
That's
friends
right.
want that burden.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so many guys will say things like, "Oh, well, I don't want to burden my friends with this." That's not what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true that some guys will react in ways that feel rejecting. Absolutely. Even in small ways, they'll change the subject, which is a form of rejection, really. But that's not really what it is. It's that you don't feel comfortable, with this person bringing this up. That's really, ultimately what that's about.
Yeah.
Um, but you're right. It really does have to be. It's really kind of a form of muscle memory. You talked about having that reflex. That's what it is. If men have not been taught how to do something that otherwise feels completely alien to them, how can we expect them, as you said, to start talking about the really big problems when they haven't even learned how to feel comfortable talking about the small ones? We've got to create that muscle memory in them. It's something that has to be taught,
Mm.
because when girls are socialized in ways still to their advantage and credit at young ages, they find that there are places they can go with other females, and they can create this, and they learn how to do it right where it is low stakes, and then it becomes much easier.
Hmm.
But we have to really walk many boys and young men through the paces for this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's totally a superpower. I mean, who
Oh
wouldn't
yeah.
want the full backing of like a supportive friend group and community? That just like imagine yourself with that power. It's like it's supercharged. It's you plus the full weight of a community, and it takes a ton of work to get there, and it takes either finding the right people or getting those small reflexes in those small transactions, like hey, I share this, you share that, and doing work, and like going back to the accountability, it does take some work and does take some pushing through that friction. But if you want to have that superpower, that's what it's going to take.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you are absolutely correct that, if this is something that we can start to really teach boys and young men, I firmly believe, as you said, that really would start to chip away at the suicide rate. I really do
Totally.
believe that.
Yeah, I think that simple playbook, and this has given me lots of ideas for maybe like a literal playbook. But and I
Yeah.
just
Oh,
think
yeah.
it totally could like indirectly lead to just lives being saved, which is an incredible impact. And so I yeah, lots of creative juices are flowing. And now I've
Good.
officially taken a full hour of your time. And so I just want
It's
to celebrate the conversation. We covered so much, from like fatherhood and expectations to the studies to conversations you had with older guys, younger guys, college kids, friction. So I just so appreciate the wealth of information. Really excited we got to make the connection. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What